Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling stories from remote villages, places so far off the map that whatever lives there has had centuries to settle in. These are accounts from people who wandered into corners of the world that don't show up on any tourist guide and found something waiting that had no business being there. Get comfortable, turn the lights up if you need to, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Story 1. I grew up about 40 minutes outside of a town called Harwick's Mill, which itself wasn't much more than a gas station and a grain elevator. Beyond that, if you kept driving north on roads that gradually stopped having names, you'd eventually hit the village of Pellins Creek. Maybe 200 people, a volunteer fire department that shared a building with the church, and one general store that smelled permanently of motor oil and old bread. My grandmother Dottie had lived there her whole life. When she passed in early November, I want to say it was a Thursday, though it might have been a Friday. The days blurred together that week. I drove up alone to help sort through her house. I wasn't close with the other people in the village. They were friendly in that cautious way small communities have with outsiders, even outsiders who share blood with someone they loved. I remember one of her neighbors, a heavy-set woman named Frances Abbott, brought over a casserole the first evening and stood in the doorway just long enough to say, "You'll want to keep the back windows latched." I assumed she meant the cold. November in that part of the state will cut right through you. Grandma Dottie's house was a two-story farmhouse, yellow paint gone gray, with a back porch that faced about 2 miles of open field before you hit the tree line. The fields had been leased out for years, soybeans, I think, though they'd been harvested long before I arrived. Just flat, dark earth and frozen stubble stretching back to those trees. Inside, the house smelled like her. Lavender and something like cedar. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen table, next to a half-finished cup of tea she'd never gotten to drink. I didn't move the cup for 3 days. I don't know why. I'd been there maybe 4 nights when I started noticing the sounds. At first I thought it was the house settling. Old farmhouses do that, especially when the temperature drops after dark. But this wasn't the creaking groan of wood contracting. It was a tapping, rhythmic and slow, coming from the back of the house. I went downstairs the first night and checked all the windows. Nothing. Wind was calm. I went back to bed and told myself it was a branch. There weren't any trees close enough to the house to have branches touching it, but I told myself that anyway. The second night it was louder, and it had moved. It was coming from the wall behind the kitchen, the exterior wall facing the back field. I pressed my hand against the plaster and felt nothing, no vibration, but I could hear it. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps, a pause. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen in wool socks and a sweatshirt at 2 in the morning, and I convinced myself it was probably an animal, a woodpecker, something like that, in the dark, in November. I went back upstairs. The third night I saw the light. I was awake before it happened, which is the part that still bothers me, like something woke me up on purpose. I went to the window and looked out at the back field, and there was a light moving through it. Not a flashlight, the beam was wrong, too diffuse, almost like bioluminescence, a pale greenish white that didn't cast shadows on the ground below it. It moved slowly, with no obvious source, drifting in from the tree line toward the house. I watched it for probably 2 minutes before I noticed the figure carrying it. And I use carrying loosely, because I'm not certain the light was being held so much as emanating from somewhere near the figure's midsection. It was tall, too tall. It moved with this elongated, unhurried gait that covered ground in a way that seemed out of proportion with how quickly its legs were moving. I couldn't make out a face. The distance was too great and the field was too dark, but the outline against the pale light was wrong in the shoulders. They were uneven. One sat higher than the other by what looked like several inches, and the head was tilted to match the lower shoulder, like someone who'd been walking at a permanent lean their entire life. I dropped below the window and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and I stayed there until the tapping on the exterior wall began. Right below where I was sitting, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, and then once, just once, 5 taps in rapid succession, like something changing its mind. I did not move. I don't know how long I sat there. My phone said it was 4:47 when I finally worked up the nerve to look out the window again, and there was nothing in the field. The light was gone. The tapping had stopped sometime around 4, I think. The silence when it ended was somehow worse. In the morning, I went outside to look at the field. I don't know what I was expecting to find. What I found was this. Pressed into the frozen soil right against the foundation of the house, directly beneath the window where I'd been sleeping, were handprints. Both hands, fingers spread, pressed deep into the earth like someone had been kneeling there and leaning their full weight forward. Except the fingers were too long, the impressions stretching another 4 or 5 inches beyond where normal fingers would end. I called Frances Abbott. I told her what I'd seen. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Did you keep the windows latched?" I said I had. She said, "Good," and that was all. I finished the sorting in 2 days and drove home. I still have a box of my grandmother's things in my garage that I haven't been able to open. Every time I pull the tape back, something about it feels like it belongs to a place I don't want to return to. Like opening it would be a kind of going back. I keep meaning to deal with it. I keep not doing it. The handprints are the thing I can't shake. Not the light, not the tapping. The handprints. Because when I measured the impressions against my own hand, the fingers were nearly twice the length of mine, and the ground in November was frozen solid. Whatever made those prints had pressed hard enough to leave marks in earth that should have been too hard to dent. Story 2. There's a stretch of road in northern New Mexico, past the village of Cimarron Bajo, where the highway department apparently gave up on signage about 15 miles before you'd want them to. I know this because I drove it alone in late July, the summer I was 28, trying to find a property my uncle had left me in a will that took 6 months to settle. I'd never met my Uncle Bernardo. He was my mother's older brother, estranged before I was born, and whatever he'd built out there in the high desert, he'd apparently decided I should have, for reasons nobody could explain to me clearly. The drive up took most of a day from Albuquerque. I had a cooler in the back seat with a 6-pack I never touched, a bag of sunflower seeds that I finished somewhere around Taos, and a paper map my mother had printed at the library because she didn't trust the GPS to work out there. She was right. The signal died about 8 miles past the last town of any size. I had an address and the paper map, and that was it. Cimarron Bajo was maybe 40 houses, a post office that doubled as someone's kitchen, and a mechanic shop with 2 trucks rusting in the lot. I stopped to ask directions from an older man sitting outside the post office in a lawn chair. His name, he told me, was Gilberto, and he'd lived there 61 years. When I told him the property I was looking for, he looked at the address on my paper for a long time without saying anything. Then he handed it back and said in very measured English, "Nobody has been out to that place for a long time." I asked him if that was a problem. He said, "There's a road, you can use it." He didn't say more than that. I should have asked more questions. I drove on. The property was a low adobe house on about 12 acres, backed by a dry arroyo and surrounded by high desert scrub, chamisa, sage, juniper twisted into shapes by years of wind. The house was in better shape than I'd expected. Furniture still inside, a wood stove, a stone well out back that I assumed was dry. I opened all the windows when I arrived because the interior had the dense, held-breath quality of a space that hadn't been aired in years. Found a half-empty bottle of tequila in the kitchen cabinet and a coat on a hook by the door that was too big to have been my uncle's. I couldn't figure out whose it was, still can't. I slept reasonably well the first night. The desert is loud in its own way: insects, the occasional distant coyote, the wind moving through the scrub with a papery whisper. None of that bothered me. What bothered me was waking at some point in the deep dark of early morning to absolute silence. No insects, no wind, just a stillness so complete that I could hear the blood in my ears. I lay still and listened to nothing for what felt like 10 minutes. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching across the yard from the direction of the arroyo. I told myself it was a deer. They come through high desert yards all the time. I grew up in the Southwest. I know how deer move, but deer move in bursts. Stop and listen, move again. These footsteps were continuous, measured, like a person walking a familiar path without any reason to hurry. They stopped outside the window. The window was covered by a thin cotton curtain my uncle had left up, and through it I could see the faint blue-gray of moonlit desert. I watched the curtain for a long time. The footsteps didn't start again. Whatever was out there simply stopped moving. I was on my feet before I made a conscious decision to stand. I moved to the side of the window and looked out at the edge of the curtain. There was a figure standing about 8 feet from the window. It was facing the house directly, not moving. I can describe it this way. It was roughly human in proportion, dressed in what appeared to be pale, loose clothing, but the proportions were just slightly wrong in the way that takes your brain a second to process. The neck was too long, the head too small for the shoulders, and as I watched, it slowly raised one arm and held it out toward the window, elbow locked, palm up, like it was presenting something to me. Its hand was empty. I stepped back from the window. When I looked again, it was gone. I spent the rest of the night on the kitchen floor with a butcher knife I found in a drawer and my back to the wood stove. Nothing happened again. By first light, I'd talked myself halfway toward the explanation that I'd been half asleep and imagined it. Then I went outside and looked at the gravel. The footprints came up from the arroyo in a clear line, crunching the fine gravel into the soil the way a person's weight does. They stopped about 8 feet from the window exactly, just as I'd judged. From that spot, there were no prints leading away. None. The gravel around the stopping point was undisturbed in every direction. Something had stood there and simply ceased to exist in place. I drove to Gilberto's post office that morning. He was already in his lawn chair with coffee. I told him what I'd seen. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he already knew. "Did it show you its hands?" he asked. I said it had. He nodded again and sipped his coffee and looked out at the road. "It does that," he said. "No one knows why. I listed the property with a realtor in Albuquerque 2 days later. I never went back." Story 3. I want to preface this by saying I'm the kind of person who looks for the logical explanation first. Always have been. I work as a soil engineer, which means I spend a lot of time looking at the ground and figuring out what's actually there rather than what people assume is there. I say this because I want you to understand that what happened to me outside the village of Harrow Fen, that's in eastern England, deep in the Norfolk Broads, was not the product of an overactive imagination. I have spent years trying to build a logical framework around it, and the framework keeps collapsing. I was 22, fresh out of university, doing a post-graduation ramble before I started the job I'd lined up. My friend Priya Venkatesson was meant to come with me. We'd planned the whole trip together over a semester, but she twisted her ankle badly the week before we were set to leave, and after a lot of back and forth, she told me to go without her. So I did. Stubbornly, in retrospect. The Norfolk Broads in late October is a particular kind of bleak, beautiful but bleak. The reeds stand taller than your head, dead brown by that time of year, and the flatness of the landscape makes you feel exposed in a way that hills don't. There's nowhere to hide, but there's also nothing blocking the view, which you'd think would be reassuring. It was. The flatness just meant I could see how far away everything else was. Harrow Fen was 8 or 9 houses clustered around a stone church, and the pub there, The Tether and Drum was open 3 days a week and served one kind of pie and 2 kinds of beer. I had both kinds of beer and the pie on my first night, sitting at the bar next to a ruddy-faced man named Owen Draycott, who farmed the land north of the village and who told me between long silences that the reed cutters used to have a saying about the East Marsh: "Don't follow sound across water." I asked him what that meant. He shrugged and said it was an old thing. I wrote it in my notebook because I collect that kind of old local saying. Then I finished my beer and went back to my rented room above the pub, which had a radiator that worked on its own schedule and a window overlooking the marsh. The next morning I set out along the public footpath that runs east from the village toward the open marsh. It was cold but clear. I had my good boots and a thermos of instant coffee that had gone lukewarm by the time I was a mile out. I kept stopping to take pictures on my phone. The quality of light in morning mist over still water is extraordinary, even in October. I remember thinking I should send one to Priya to make her jealous. The path split about 2 miles out. One direction had a weathered wooden marker, the other didn't. I took the unmarked one. I know. For the first hour nothing was wrong except for the cold and the silence. That deep quiet of wetlands, where even your footsteps are absorbed by the soft ground. I reached a broad channel of open water that I estimated was about 30 meters across, with reed beds on both sides and a ruined stone wall on the far bank that I wanted to photograph. There was no bridge, but the channel looked shallow and there were stepping stones just visible under the surface. I crossed carefully, got my photos, and turned back. On the way back, I heard someone crying. It was a woman's voice coming from somewhere in the reeds to my left. Quiet, irregular sobbing, the kind of sound that doesn't carry but that you feel rather than hear. I stopped. I called out. The crying stopped the instant I called. I waited, then I called again. Nothing. I told myself it was a bird. Certain waterfowl make sounds that are unnervingly human. I believed this about 60%. I kept walking. The crying started again when I was maybe 200 meters further on. Closer. I hadn't moved toward it, and it had moved toward me. But reeds muffle and redirect sound in weird ways. I told myself that too. Then it called my name, not my full name, just the name my parents used when I was a child, a shortened version that I had not used since I was about 12 and that I had certainly not introduced myself by at the Tether and Drum. Priya used it sometimes, but Priya was in Bristol with a swollen ankle. The voice came from directly to my left, maybe 15 feet off the path, somewhere inside the dense reed bed. It was a woman's voice. It sounded like someone in real distress. I am not proud to say I took 2 steps toward it. What stopped me, and I have thought about this a great deal, was not logic. It was a physical sensation, a resistance in my legs like wading against current that had no explanation. My feet had sunk slightly into the soft mud beside the path, and as I looked down at them, trying to understand why I'd stopped, I noticed the reeds directly ahead of me. They were leaning inward. Not bending in wind, there was no wind, but gradually, slowly angling toward the path as though something was pressing through them from the far side, something too wide to have been human. I stepped back onto the path. The crying started immediately again, moving now along the far side of the reed bed at a pace that matched my walking, not ahead of me, not behind, exactly parallel. When I walked faster, it moved faster. When I stopped, it stopped. I crossed back over the channel at a pace I would describe as not quite running. I told myself the stones were slippery and I needed to be careful. The crying did not follow across the water. I got to the near bank and stood with my heart doing something irregular in my chest, and after a long moment the silence came back, the proper silence, without anything moving inside it. When I got back to the village, Owen Draycott was in the car park of the pub. He looked at me for a moment, then at the mud on my boots. "Stayed to the path?" he asked. I told him mostly. He nodded and said, "You'll be all right then." I never asked him what he meant. Part of me didn't want to know the answer, and part of me thinks he wouldn't have told me anyway. When I uploaded the photographs that evening, there were 3 I didn't remember taking, all from the same general area, the reed bed. In each one, the reeds in the middle distance were bent inward in a rough arc, framing a gap that showed nothing but the open marsh beyond. In the 3rd photo, at the very edge of the gap, there was something pale that I can't explain, and that doesn't resolve into anything recognizable no matter how many times I zoom in. I've never shown those photos to anyone. I can't make myself delete them either. I went home the following morning, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Story 4. My dad used to say that the Kessler property was none of our business, which was basically the way he said everything involving the north end of Goat Tooth Ridge. It was half a day's walk from our house in the valley below the village of Sutter's Fork, deep in West Virginia hill country, and the old man would go quiet and look at something in the middle distance whenever anyone brought it up. I was curious about it, the way kids are curious about anything they're not supposed to touch, when I was 17, and this is a story I've never told my dad. By the way, my friend Decker Olson and I decided we'd go have a look. Decker was the kind of person who wore his risk tolerance like a badge of honor, and whose judgment I trusted slightly more than I should have. We told our parents we were camping on the South Ridge, which wasn't technically a lie, just not specific about direction. We packed sleeping bags, an old tent Decker's dad had used in the 80s, food for 2 nights and a flashlight each. The walk up was a clear fall afternoon. Leaves were mostly down, so we could see further through the trees than you can in summer, which felt like it should be reassuring, but actually made the ridge feel larger and emptier than I remembered from summer hikes. I'd brought a bag of beef jerky, a pack of Oreos that got smashed at some point during the climb, and the 2nd volume of a fantasy series I'd been meaning to finish for months. I never read it. I also had a blister forming on my left heel by the 1st mile that I kept meaning to stop and cover with moleskin. I did not stop. We got to the Kessler place around 4 in the afternoon. It was a farmstead, or had been a stone foundation, most of a barn still standing. A root cellar dug into the hillside with a wooden door hanging at an angle. The main house was gone except for the foundation walls, but in one corner the remains of a fireplace stood to about chest height, and there were still some rotted fence posts marking where a yard had been. Decker immediately wanted to look in the root cellar. I said we should set up camp first. We compromised by looking in the root cellar first. It was empty. Earth floor, low ceiling, a smell of old vegetables and cold stone. There were 2 wooden shelves on one wall, empty except for a mason jar with the lid rusted shut, and a small pile of what looked like dried herbs tied with a leather cord. I picked up the herb bundle and it fell apart in my hand, so old it had lost any smell. I put it back on the shelf because even at 17, I understood on some level that you shouldn't move things you don't understand. We set up camp in the yard near the fireplace remnant because it was the only level ground. Nothing happened the first night. I want to be clear about that, because memory has a way of retrofitting unease onto moments that were actually fine. The night was cold and quiet and unremarkable, and I read my book by flashlight until Decker told me to turn it off because it was keeping him awake. The 2nd night was different. We spent the day exploring the surrounding area, going maybe a half mile out in different directions through the trees. At one point, Decker found what he called a well, but was more likely an old mine shaft capped with stones. We left it alone. I found a tree with a section of bark stripped away in a shape I couldn't explain, not bare scratch, too deliberate, too high on the trunk. I thought about it on the walk back to camp. We ate, we talked. Decker fell asleep early. I was awake when the singing started. That's not exactly the right word. It was more like a sustained tone, low and wavering, the kind of sound that sits right at the edge of the register where you're not sure if you're hearing it or feeling it. It came from uphill, from further up the ridge. It rose and fell in a slow pattern that had no melody I could identify but had clearly a structure of some kind, intentional. I lay in my sleeping bag and told myself it was wind through the remaining barn boards. Then I looked at the tent wall. There was a silhouette on it, cast by our dying campfire, a shape just outside the tent, standing upright facing the tent. The silhouette of a person-shaped figure with one arm held straight up above its head, reaching, and the other hanging directly down, like a scarecrow pose. It didn't move. I sat up. I put my hand on Decker's shoulder to wake him, and the silhouette turned. Slowly, deliberately, turning to face the tent from the side rather than head-on. The head was wrong, proportionally too large, and as it turned I could see that it was not a head but a cluster of something, branches, maybe, or arranged shapes that created the impression of a head without actually being one. Decker woke up. I pointed at the tent wall. By the time he looked, the fire had burned lower and the silhouette was fainter, but it was still there, still in that side-facing position. Decker said in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual, "That's a person." I said I knew. We sat still. The silhouette moved. Not toward us, it walked in a wide, slow arc around the tent, visible on each wall in turn, the way something circles a light source. It made no sound on the leaves. That was what I found hardest to accept, standing in the middle of the night with leaves 3 inches deep on every flat surface within earshot. No crunch, no rustle, just the silent circumnavigation and that low sustained tone that had never stopped. It circled the tent twice. Then the silhouette was on the tent wall again, front-facing, arms still raised. It stayed there for a count of maybe 30 seconds. Then the fire died down enough that the silhouette faded. Decker and I did not sleep. We talked quietly until dawn, not about what we'd seen, mostly about other things, I don't know why, and broke camp in the gray early light and walked down the ridge without discussing it. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. We didn't talk about it, period, until maybe 5 years later, and by then we'd both moved away from Sutter's Fork and weren't close anymore. I went back to my dad's truck once during that time, and I found something jammed under the windshield wiper. A strip of bark from a white birch, about the length of my forearm, with something scratched into it with what must have been a rock or a nail. A shape, long upright body, 2 long downward lines for legs, 1 arm raised above the head and 1 hanging straight down. Exactly what I'd seen on the tent wall. No one had seen me at the ridge, I was certain of that. No one in the valley would have known to leave that. I threw it away. I wish I hadn't. Not because I want the proof, I know what I saw, but because I keep thinking about who made it and how and why, and whether leaving it at my truck was a warning or something else entirely. Story 5. The summer I turned 30, I took a job that seemed, at the time, like the least interesting work I could have found. Reservoir maintenance for a water district in rural Montana, about 40 miles from the nearest town of any real size. The nearest community was a place called Elk Hollow, about 60 residents, a feed store, and a bar that was open whenever Marge Tulliver decided to open it, which was more consistent than it sounds. I stayed in a small company trailer at the edge of the reservoir property, drove the maintenance truck to the dam and the filtration shed every morning, and spent my evenings doing not much of anything. I had my guitar. I had a lot of podcasts downloaded. I had a fishing rod I used twice. I'm telling you this to say that for the first 3 weeks, this job was genuinely boring, and I was getting comfortable with boring. My coworker was a man named Pavel Sarenko, who drove up from the town of Millbridge 3 days a week and did the heavy mechanical work on the pump systems. He was taciturn in a way that felt deliberate, not unfriendly, just economical with words. The 3rd week we were there, he told me that the reservoir had been built in 1962 and that there'd been a settlement underneath it before the valley was flooded. A small homesteading community that relocated. Their church is still down there, he said, matter-of-factly, looking out at the water. On a clear day you can almost see the steeple. I looked. I couldn't see anything. I filed it away. I noticed the first sign on a Tuesday morning, or I think it was Tuesday. I'd been there long enough that the days had started blending. I was doing a routine perimeter walk when I found a section of the chain-link fence along the western edge bent inward, as though something very heavy had leaned against it from the outside. The ground on the outside of the fence was undisturbed, no prints in the soft mud that collected there after rain. I logged it as wind damage, which in retrospect was exactly the kind of thing you tell yourself when you're living alone and want to keep sleeping. The evenings were long and quiet. I'd sit outside the trailer when the weather allowed and watch the reservoir change color as the light changed. There's something about large bodies of still water that's calming and faintly unsettling in equal measure. The way they hold the sky's reflection like a mirror, the way they have their own surface sounds that don't match the wind. I'd been watching the water most evenings without incident. And then one evening I saw something move under it. Not a fish. Too slow, too large, too purposeful. A pale shape maybe 15 feet below the surface, moving from the deeper center toward the shallower area near the bank below the trailer. I leaned forward on my camp chair and watched it until the light was too low to see clearly. The shape moved slowly and then stopped directly below where I was sitting, about 30 feet offshore. It didn't move again. I sat there watching the water until dark, and then I went inside. I told myself it was a large catfish, or a reflection, or some distortion of the last daylight. I told myself a lot of things over the next few days. Pavel came up on a Wednesday. I'm fairly sure it was the day after, and we worked on the north pump system until around 2. I asked him, casual as I could manage, whether there were large fish in the reservoir. He told me they didn't allow fishing and the water was stocked only with what filtered in from the watershed. He asked me why. I said I'd seen something large. He looked at me the way people look at you when they've decided not to say the thing they're thinking. "Stay away from the water after dark," he said, and turned back to the pump. That night I was woken at some point. I don't know what time. I'd left my phone charging in the truck and didn't know until later that it was 20 past 2 by the sound of something moving outside the trailer. Not footsteps exactly, more like a wet dragging, like something large moving across gravel, something that wasn't lifting its weight. I looked out the small side window of the trailer. I don't have language for this that I find satisfying, so I'll just say what I saw. On the gravel between the trailer and the reservoir bank, there was a shape. Low to the ground, pale, roughly the size of a person but not upright, it moved with a horizontal motion, like it was pulling itself forward on limbs that didn't work the way limbs should. Its surface caught the moonlight in a way that looked wet. I watched it cross maybe 20 feet of gravel in what felt like a very long time, moving from the water toward the trailer. It stopped maybe 15 feet from the trailer door. I didn't breathe. I am not using that as a figure of speech. I literally stopped breathing until my vision started to dull. The shape was still. In the moonlight I could see, and I wish I couldn't, that its head, or what I was reading as a head, was turned upward, tilted at an angle too severe to be comfortable, facing the window where I stood. There were no features I could resolve, just the pale wet shine of it and the angle of that raised head in the dark. I backed away from the window. I sat on the floor between the bed and the wall with a work flashlight in my hand, and I stayed there until the sky lightened outside. The dragging sound did not come again. When I finally opened the trailer door at first light, the gravel was undisturbed. No trail, no marks, nothing disturbed. Except that directly in front of the door, arranged in a line, were 3 smooth oval stones from the reservoir bed. Stones that had no business being on the gravel. Stones that came from somewhere below the water. I packed my personal gear into my truck that morning and drove down to Elk Hollow and told the water district they needed to find someone else for the remainder of the contract. They were not happy about it. I paid back half my advance. I considered it a reasonable transaction. Story 6. My mother's family has a complicated relationship with the village of Myra Lorca. It's a small fishing community on the coast of northern Chile, hours from the nearest city, where several generations of Espinasas settled before half of them moved north and became, eventually, my mother. She went back once when I was 8, and I have a photograph of her standing in front of her grandmother's house with an expression I could never read, not unhappy, but wary, like she was checking something that she expected to find out of place. When I was 25, fresh out of a relationship, and in the particular kind of restlessness that follows a significant loss, I decided to go to Myra Lorca. My mother spent 2 phone calls trying to talk me out of it, and when that didn't work, she gave me her cousin's address and made me promise to call every night. Her cousin was a woman named Renata Fuentes, 70 years old, who made the best fish stew I've ever tasted, and who watched me with a careful eye from the moment I arrived. The village was built on a series of low hills above a rocky shore, 30 or 40 families, most of them connected to the fishing trade in some way. The boats went out in the early morning and came back by afternoon. The evenings were quiet dinner, a card game at the one small cafe, early sleep. I wasn't sleeping well, and I filled my nights by walking the coastal path that ran north of the village. The coastal path in that part of Chile is extraordinary. Volcanic rock worn smooth, sea spray in your face even on calm nights, and the Pacific stretching out to the horizon without interruption. I walked it 3 or 4 nights before anything happened. I'd bought a windproof jacket from a shop in the nearest large town that was slightly too big in the shoulders and made a sound in the wind like a flag. I'd found a good flat stone at the trailhead where I sat and watched the moon on the water before I started the walk proper. Small things. The path runs north along the cliff edge for about 2 miles before it dips inland past a small fishing shrine, a stone niche with a painted figure of the virgin fresh flowers placed regularly by someone from the village. Past the shrine, the path continued to what I'd been told was an abandoned cannery, and I'd been intending to go look at it. I was about 100 meters past the shrine when I stopped. There was someone standing on the cliff edge ahead of me, a woman or a figure in a woman's shape, standing very close to the edge, facing out to sea, completely still. I assumed at first she was someone from the village, out for a night walk like me. I slowed down and called out a greeting. She didn't respond. The wind was strong. I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. I got within 20 feet and called again. She turned. And the problem, the thing I could not immediately process, was that she turned at the waist only. The lower half of her body remained facing the sea. The upper body rotated to face me fully, a 180-degree turn from the waist that no person can make, that no spine will permit. I stood with my hands loose at my sides and watched her upper body face me at that impossible angle while her feet and legs still pointed toward the water. Her face was my mother's face, not like my mother, not similar. My mother's face, exactly as I knew it, every familiar detail, but pale and still in a way that my mother's face never was. Looking at me without expression in the way that something wears a face without understanding what a face is for. I backed away from it. I didn't run, I don't know why, maybe something knew running would change the nature of whatever was happening. I walked backward at a measured pace, keeping it in view until I reached the shrine, and as I backed past the shrine, the figure on the cliff stopped turning to follow me. It went still, then slowly it rotated its upper body back to face the sea. I went back to Renata's house. I sat in her kitchen and she made tea without asking and sat across from me. After a while, I told her what I'd seen. She nodded, not surprised. She said, "The women in my family have a word for it. My grandmother saw it once." I asked her what the word was. She told me, and I've written the phonetic version of it down somewhere, but I can't reproduce it here. I asked her what it meant. She thought for a moment and said, "The thing that knows you." She paused. "It doesn't mean it well." I called my mother that night. I told her I'd been on the coastal path. A long silence, and then she said very quietly, "I walked that path too when I was there." Another silence. "I never told you about the woman on the cliff." I had not said a word about the cliff. I flew home 4 days later. I did not walk the coastal path again. My mother and I have never discussed it further, but sometimes on the phone when we're talking about something else entirely, we both go quiet at the same moment. I think we're both thinking about the same face. Story 7. I don't have a reason to have been in the village of Dragony that would satisfy a logical person. My best explanation is that I had found a reference to it in a travel essay I'd read in a magazine at my dentist's office, and something about the description: a mountain village in southern Romania, population 80, medieval church, a valley that held fog in the mornings for an unusually long time, made me put it on a list in my phone. 3 years later, I was burned out from a job I'd been doing for too long, and I took a month off and worked down the list. I was 31. I'd been traveling alone for 3 weeks, and the easy sociability of the first week had worn off into a quieter internal rhythm that I actually preferred. I rented a room from a family named Narration, father, mother, adult son named Andre who spoke some English, and served as my accidental translator whenever I stumbled into a conversation I couldn't navigate. I had good boots, a rain jacket, a small notebook I wrote in every evening. I ate whatever was put in front of me and slept well at high altitude. The valley was everything the essay had promised. Steep-sided, dense with spruce forest on the upper slopes, a single road and that doubled back on itself twice on the way up. The village clung to a shelf of level ground halfway up the valley wall, with views down to a silver ribbon of river and up to ridgelines that had snow on them even in September. I spent my days walking. I had a rough hand-drawn map Andre had made me, with trails marked and 2 areas crossed out with what I thought was a cautionary squiggle. I asked him about the crossed-out areas. He said they were not good for walking. I asked why. He thought for a moment and said, "People get confused there." I assumed he meant the trails were poorly marked. On my 6th day, I found the tree. I was on a lower trail, maybe a mile from the village, following the contour of the hillside through mature spruce forest. The trees were close together, and the light on the forest floor was dim even at midday. I'd been walking for about an hour when I came around a large boulder and stopped. A spruce tree, dead, bark stripped, pale against the living trees around it, was covered in objects, tied to every available branch with wire and cord. Small wooden shapes, carved roughly into human figures, maybe 100 of them at varying heights from near the ground to 15 feet up. Some were very old, the wood gray and checked. Some were new enough that the cut would still showed pale. Beneath the tree, the ground had been cleared of dead needles, which in that forest was unnatural. Everything was carpeted with duff. The cleared ground was exposed soil, dark and smooth, and in the center of it, arranged in a neat row, were 7 human teeth. I stood there for about a minute. Then I took a photo and walked back to the village faster than I'd walked out. Andre looked at my photo for a long time. He showed it to his mother, who looked at it and then handed the phone back without speaking. He said something to her in Romanian, and she responded, and he nodded slowly. "There is a man in the village," he said to me. "Old man. He says this tree has been here longer than anyone remembers. He says it is not for us to touch." I asked if it was religious. Andre thought about the word for a moment. "Like that," he said, "but older." I didn't go back to that trail. I started taking Andre's map more seriously. On my second to last night, I woke to find my window open. I had not opened it. It was cold at altitude, and I'd specifically latched it before bed. I sat up and looked at the open window and the dark rectangle of mountain sky beyond it, and in the time it took my eyes to adjust, I saw that there was something on the outside sill. A small carved wooden figure, identical to the ones on the tree, set directly in the center of the sill, facing inward toward me. I didn't touch it. I lay back down and watched the ceiling until morning. When I went to look at the sill in daylight, the figure was gone. No scratch marks, no sign it had been there. But in my notebook, which I had left closed on the desk, the page I'd last written on had a small pressed indentation in it, as though something had been set down on it with some weight. The indentation was oval, about the size of a small carved figure's base. I've never been able to explain the indentation in the notebook. The window I can construct a story around, someone from the village, a joke, a warning, I don't know. But the indentation in the closed notebook means someone opened the notebook, placed the figure on it, and then removed both. In a locked room, while I slept. I don't think it was a person from the village. Story 8. The summer after my junior year of university, I took a job on a trail crew in northern Idaho. Hard physical work, good pay, 14 days on and 7 days off. I liked the physical exhaustion of it, and I liked the crew, 4 of us, rotating pairs on different trail sections. My consistent partner through most of the summer was a woman named Sorcha O'Brien, Irish-born, 5 years older than me, with an entirely different relationship to the wilderness than I had. She grew up in Galway and had never been in terrain like the Selkirk Mountains until that summer, and she approached it with a combination of caution and wonder that I found both charming and, eventually, instructive. The section of trail we were assigned for the 3rd rotation was in a valley called Cutter's Draw, about 20 miles from the nearest road via a fire track. We were dropped by a ranger's truck at the trailhead with 14 days of supplies, 2-way radios that worked about a third of the time, and a handwritten note from the district supervisor listing the tasks. Clearing blowdown from the previous winter, resetting some cairns, checking culverts. Standard summer work. Cutter's Draw was beautiful in a severe way. Narrow and deep, the creek running down its center ice-cold even in July, the walls steep and forested. We set up a base camp at a wide point in the valley floor where the creek curved, and there was a gravel bar to pitch the tents on. The first 3 days were fine, productive, tiring, unremarkable. My coffee every morning tasted slightly of the water filter, and I kept meaning to replace the filter cartridge. I found a woodpecker's cache of acorns in a hollow snag one afternoon and spent 20 minutes examining it. Small things. The first sign was the silence. Cutter's Draw had a consistent background noise, creek, wind in the upper canopy, birds. The birds stopped on our 4th morning. Not suddenly, but over about 2 hours of working, I realized I hadn't heard anything except the creek and our tools for a while. I mentioned it to Sorcha. She stopped working and listened. "Aye," she said, "since maybe 9. We both looked at the forest. The forest looked back, blank and still. We went back to work. That afternoon, Sorcha found prints in the creek mud at the base of the valley wall. She called me over without saying what she'd found. I looked at them. They were roughly humanoid, bipedal, 2 feet, 5 toes each, but the stride length was wrong for a person of any normal height. The prints were about 11 inches long, but the gap between left and right was nearly 3 feet, the gait of something much taller than should have left prints that size. The right print consistently sank deeper than the left, like something with an uneven weight distribution, or a limp. I said maybe a bear walking upright. Sorcha said, "For how long?" and pointed to where the prints continued down the valley floor as far as we could see. A very long stretch of bipedal prints with that irregular spacing. No place where the gait changed to quadrupedal. We followed them for maybe 50 feet before we both, by unspoken agreement, turned back. We didn't discuss what we'd seen in a serious way that evening. We made dinner and talked about other things, normal crew talk about the work and people back home, and nothing significant. We were both doing the same thing, keeping the normal world thick around us. I woke at approximately 3 in the morning to find the zipper of my tent pulled halfway down from the outside. Not the inside, from the outside. The pull tab is designed for interior use. Pulling from outside requires either a stick or a finger inserted through the mesh. The zipper was at chest height on the tent door, which on an external pull means something standing at roughly my height had reached to chest level. I lay in my sleeping bag and looked at the half-open door and the dark beyond it and did not move. Whatever had unzipped it was gone, or not gone but not visible. I called to Sorcher in the other tent. She was awake. She'd heard something too, she said later, a sound of breathing near the tent that she'd been lying frozen through. We talked through the thin tent walls until daylight, our voices low, making noise on purpose because noise felt like it might matter. In the morning, we found that the food barrel, a bare canister, 60 meters from camp in the regulation spot, had been moved. Not opened, not damaged. Moved about 20 feet from where we'd placed it, set upright against a tree. Something had carried a 50-pound barrel 20 feet and stood it neatly against a tree trunk. The two-way radio produced only static that morning. We broke camp. We hiked out in one day, 14 miles over hard terrain, carrying more than was comfortable. We didn't stop for lunch. We submitted a report to the district office that I wrote as carefully and neutrally as I could. The supervisor asked a few questions, made a note, and told us they'd look into it. I don't believe they did. Sorcha sent me a message about 2 weeks after we got back. She de-developed the roll of disposable camera film she'd been shooting through the summer. She found one photograph she didn't remember taking, couldn't remember the moment at all. It was a shot looking up the valley from near camp, late afternoon light, nothing remarkable except the tree line in the mid-distance. Between 2 spruce trees, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a vertical pale shape, too narrow to be a tree, standing still, facing the camera. She said it was probably a birch. I agreed with her because it was easier. Neither of us brought it up again. Story 9. The village of Kaldar sits on the eastern shore of a fjord in Norway, about an hour north of where the highway ends and tourism gives up. I went there in February, which, looking back, was a choice that tells you something about where my head was at. My partner Elias Vatten had grown up there and had gone back for his grandfather's 90th birthday, and he'd invited me to come. I'd never been to Norway in winter. I had not adequately processed what February in a North Norwegian fishing village would involve. It involved darkness, polar night. The sun stays below the horizon, and you get this strange blue twilight in the middle of the day that lasts a few hours and then retreats again. Everything is lit by a combination of snow-reflected moonlight and the warm glow of house windows, which creates an atmosphere that is genuinely beautiful and also, after the 3rd or 4th day, slightly unnerving in a way that's hard to specify. You start to feel like the normal boundaries of night and day have been suspended, and with them some other, harder-to-name categories. Elias' family was warm and enormous, 3 generations plus assorted cousins who arrived over the first weekend for the party. I liked them very much. His grandfather, whose name I will not get right in writing but which sounded like Torsten, was a lean, sharp-eyed man who had opinions about everything and who decided after about an hour that I was worth talking to. He spoke limited English, but Elias translated. We sat by the wood stove most of the first afternoon. At one point, Torsten asked if I planned to walk the shore path. I said I'd been thinking about it. He was quiet for a moment and then said something to Elias that Elias translated as, he says, "Don't go past where the boathouses end." I asked why, more Norwegian. He says something lives in the rocks past there. It's been there as long as his grandfather's grandfather can remember. I smiled because I thought he might be joking. Torsten looked at me with his sharp, serious eyes, and I realized he was not. On my fourth night there, after the birthday celebration had wound down and the cousins had mostly gone back to their own houses, I couldn't sleep. Elias was sleeping heavily beside me. I dressed and went out. The village at 2 in the morning in polar night is extraordinary. No wind that night. The fjord was a sheet of black glass reflecting a slice of moon. The boathouses ran along the shore, red-painted wood, locked and quiet. I walked the shore path with my hands in my pockets, breath clouding in the cold, and the snow crunching under my boots was the only sound in the world. I thought about how people had lived here for centuries, in this light and this cold, and I found it more admirable than I had words for. I walked past where the boathouses ended. I want to be clear that I knew I was doing this. It wasn't absent-mindedness. I was cold and the path was good, and the beauty of the fjord in that peculiar blue dark was doing something to my judgment. I walked maybe 200 meters past the last boathouse to where the shore path ran close to the water's edge and the rocks began, big, ancient boulders at the waterline, ice-fringed, the kind of geological permanence that makes you feel small. I heard something in the rocks. A low, regular sound like breathing, but much slower than any animal's respiration. Each breath in lasted about 15 seconds, each breath out the same, between them silence. I stood on the path and listened to this slow, regular cycling of breath and could not see its source. The rocks were in shadow, the moonlight not reaching past the first row of boulders. Then something shifted in the rocks. I saw movement, a repositioning of weight, the way a large animal settles when it changes posture. Something very large. And then from the darkness between two boulders, a hand came into the moonlight. Just a hand resting flat on the top of the lower boulder. A human hand in every detail, fingers, knuckles, the slight translucency of cold skin in moonlight, except the scale was wrong. The hand was enormous, each finger as thick as my forearm, the palm flat on a boulder surface that would have required a body behind it of inconceivable size. The slow breathing continued. The hand did not move. It rested there on the rock with the easy weight of something that had done this many times before. I stood on the path and looked at it for a span of time I could not measure. And then, from somewhere deep in the rocks, a sound, not breath this time, but a sound like a voice forming consonants without meaning, low and resonant, felt through my sternum more than heard. I walked back to the village, quickly, without running. I'm not sure why not running mattered to me, but it did. In the morning, I told Elias what I'd seen. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was going to tell Torsten. I said I'd rather he didn't. He said, he'll want to know that you saw it. He says most visitors don't see it. I asked what that meant. Elias thought about it. He says it's usually discreet. The word seemed wrong for something that size. I didn't say that. When we left 4 days later, I shook Torsten's hand at the door. He held my hand for a moment after the shake and looked at me with those sharp old eyes, and he said something in Norwegian. Elias translated it on the way to the car. He says it let you see it. That's not something to feel good about or bad about. That's just something that happened. I've thought about that distinction many times, between being seen and being allowed to see. Whether it matters who initiates the encounter, whether something that has lived in rocks since before your grandfather's grandfather can even remember you being there. I still don't know what to do with the thought. I just know that I carry it. Story 10. The last time I went to Owl Crest, I was 33 years old, and there for a reason I didn't fully admit to myself until I was already there. My older brother Nalan Beauchamp had spent 3 years talking about a piece of land he'd bought at the edge of a village in the Sierra Madre foothills, about 40 acres, a seasonal creek, a small hunting cabin that hadn't been maintained in a decade. He'd gone up twice and both times come back quieter than he'd left, and neither time would he tell me what the land was like or what he was planning to do with it. 3 months before my trip, Nalan died in an accident that had nothing to do with the property, and I found myself, after the worst of the grief had settled into the manageable weight that it eventually becomes, wanting to see the place he'd been so careful not to describe. Owl Crest was a loose collection of structures rather than a proper village. 15, 20 families spread over a few square miles of chaparral and oak woodland, connected by dirt roads and the kind of neighbor knowledge that substitutes for infrastructure when infrastructure doesn't reach. The general store had a hand-lettered sign that had been there long enough to be unreadable. There was a small bar attached to a bait shop. I stopped there first and introduced myself as Nalan Beauchamp's brother. The woman behind the bar, Marguerite, she said, Marguerite Duhamel, looked at me carefully when I said his name and then poured me a beer without asking and said, "He was in here a few times." "Quiet man." I said he was. She said he'd asked her about the land when he first came up. I asked what he'd wanted to know. She was quiet for a moment, wiping down the bar. "He wanted to know about the hollow on the north end," she said. "The low place where the creek bends." She didn't say what she'd told him. I didn't push. The cabin was in worse shape than I'd expected, even accounting for the decade of neglect. One window broken, the porch sagging on the left side, a smell inside of mouse and old ash, and something I associated with deep damp, like the inside of a cave. But structurally sound enough to sleep in, which was all I needed. I sat up on the floor in the main room with my sleeping bag and a battery lantern, and I spent the first evening going through a box of Nalan's things that I'd brought with me, notes he'd made, photographs, a surveyor's map of the property with some markings in pencil I couldn't interpret. He'd circled the north end of the property on the map, the low place where the creek bent. He'd written something beside the circle that I read 3 times before I understood it. "Don't go at dusk." I turned off the lantern and lay in the dark for a long time. I went the next morning in bright, flat November light. The north end of the property was a quarter-mile walk through dry oak brush, the creek audible before visible. Where it bent, the land dropped into a shallow hollow maybe 40 feet across, lower than the surrounding terrain by a few feet, the kind of depression that holds cold air and late-season water. The creek ran through the lowest point and had cut a clay bank on the far side. And on the clay bank, covering maybe 30 feet of the exposed face, were handprints, not like what you make with paint, pressed directly into the clay, deep impressions, dozens and dozens of them at different heights and depths, some old, dried and cracked, some recent, the edges still sharp, the clay still dark with moisture, all human-sized, all pressed flat palmed. They covered the bank from about ankle height to maybe 7 feet up. I stood at the edge of the hollow and looked at them for a long time. I took photographs. I walked to the bank and looked at the most recent ones up close. The clay was cold and firm. I pressed my own hand against an empty section of the bank to test the depth required to make an impression. I had to push with my full weight. Whatever had made those prints had pressed hard enough to sink an inch into the clay, from just ankle height to 7 feet up, over what looked like a very long period of time. I went back to the cabin. I cooked dinner. I did not go out after dark. Around 10 at night, something came to the cabin, not to the door, to the space below the cabin. The porch sat on low wooden posts, maybe 18 inches of clearance, and whatever came moved into that space from the north, slow and deliberate, and the porch boards above my head deflected slightly under a weight I could not account for. It moved across the length of the cabin and stopped at the far end, and then very slowly made the return crossing, back toward the north. This happened 3 times. Each pass took maybe 4 minutes. I lay on the floor with my lantern dark and my hand pressed flat on the boards above me, and on the second pass I felt it, the slight shift of the wood under something's weight moving directly above where my hand was. Something with mass, something deliberate, something that had, I realized with a particular cold clarity, made all those handprints in the clay bank. Something that pressed its hands against surfaces and left marks and moved slowly through the dark, and apparently had been doing this on this particular piece of land since long before Nalan bought it or before anyone in Owl Crest could remember. The third pass ended. The sound receded. Silence came back. In the morning, I found a single handprint pressed into the soft soil directly outside the cabin's front door. Centered on the threshold, facing inward, fresh, the same depth as the ones on the clay bank. Nalan's notes were on the table where I'd left them, and I looked again at the circled hollow and his words beside it. Don't go at dusk, not don't go at night, not stay away. Just don't go at dusk, the transition hour, when whatever lives in that hollow is apparently most active or most visible, I don't know which. He'd gone twice and come back quieter both times, and maybe he'd worked out enough of the rules to keep himself safe. Or maybe the rules he'd worked out were incomplete. I sold the property 6 months later to a land trust that intended to keep it undeveloped. I didn't tell them why. I hope whoever walks those 40 acres next has enough sense to stay out of the hollow after dark, and to watch the clay bank by the creek bend, where the prints are surely still accumulating, patient and deep and uncountable. I hope for their sake that whatever makes them is satisfied with clay. Thanks for watching. If these stories stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe. We put out new stories every week, and we'd love to have you with us. Drop a comment letting us know which story unsettled you most tonight, and share this video with a friend who's brave enough to watch alone in the dark. Until next time, keep the windows latched, stay on the path, and don't follow sound across water.